Happy days are here again, the skies above are clear again. Let us sing a song of cheer.
Okay. So our unit of impact is the coefficient giving dollar, which is defined as the value of giving $1 to someone with an income of $50,000 a year. So basically, you can think about that as the baseline as we just give our donors money to people in high income countries. And everything else we would do is compare it against that. So our calculations of social return. The framework is that all the grants cash out in either income or health. And we don't currently use self-reported well-being or have really any other canonical value that we're plugging in on a number of grants. So for valuing lead exposure reduction, the way that that's calculated is trying to estimate the downstream impacts of lead on IQ, which then translates to income, as well as looking at the health impact.
We had like 2 or 3 of these. And when I came on board, the way that these cost effectiveness analyses were working were just very, very straightforwardly using disability weights to estimate the DALY cost of major depression. And for those who know, which should be almost everybody here, that involves picking between mild, moderate, or severe depression from the disability weights. And so one thing that transpired when we started to do a few reevaluations was just this issue that like the cost effectiveness started to look different depending on how you decided to linearize and whether you picked mild, moderate, or severe, and how you want to interpret those in the context of different measurement instruments, PHQ-9. And that started to have implications for what we were recommending and how we rated it. And we decided that it would be useful to be able
kind of framing of this workshop. Suppose that I have this intervention and the intervention causes, and I have causal evidence that people change the numbers that people say. Now, the question that I have to ask myself, well, is it the case that it changed the way people use the scale? So, taking, for example, psychotherapy, is it the case that now people just think about these numbers in a different way? Or is it, in fact, the case that the latent underlying construct has changed? And only in that case should we believe in the metas, the master metric, the key metric. But of course, every other metric that we have, like, for example, coefficient givings, income doublings, or the DALY, or the quality adjusted life year, or insert whichever other thing you currently care about, will have concerns that roughly map onto the structure that I've laid out onto the well-being. I think I should stop talking.
Scale use correction matters that may be less obvious and haven't been in the documents. The other one I'll just mention briefly is the income conversion. Scale use correction changes the income coefficient. So if you convert to income with in the usual way by dividing whatever regression coefficient you have on the whatever effect size you have on the income coefficient, you're going to get a much bigger number. Like when we converted unemployment, we got 5 times as big a number after scale use correction. Scale use correction has a particularly large effect on the income coefficient.
In well-being, the condition that has the biggest loss in well-being is more than 1 point on a 0 to 10 scale is depression. And you can see there seems to be 2 of these that have more effect on well-being than the others. And these happen to be the mental health conditions. If you look at them in terms of kind of rankings within each, it looks like life satisfaction is much more affected by these mental health conditions than the physical ones, whereas the DALYs kind of
to move on soon, but
Yeah,
this is
please.
interesting. I'm happy to keep talking. And about this, I'm Julian. I also happen to have my father visiting, sitting next to me, which normally I wouldn't just bring my father onto the call, but it's Dean Jamison, and he kind of helped originate DALYs and was the lead editor of GPD in this space. So if we want to know something about the history of DALYs, if he's willing to say a few words, it might be useful. He's not a big fan of DALYs now. I think I can headline that actually say, but I'll let him talk.
Well, fatal outcomes, but half of them have no easily ascertained YLD measure of burden. About half, slightly fewer than half. And in my view, many of the ones that do have a YLD version have the associated disability weights and the associated durations are prima facie simply not sensible. So even before you get to the question of comparison with mortality risk and the disutility of incurring more mortality risk, there's a
the email from you and Julian, but I will do so later on, is there's this lurking issue of kind of the badness of death. And so actually that's this kind of third separate thing. There's neutrality, there's also this age weighting. You could also complicate it more with population ethics and other sorts of things. So that's a kind of elephant in the room. On this table, on this kind of well-being weight. So actually in HLI, we're now working on this. So for a while, people have said to us, okay, what's the difference between a DALY and a WELLBY? And we've said, look, we don't really know. One comes from people's expectations, the other comes from people's experiences. But we've realized that's kind of not really a good enough answer. So
screen. The fundamental problem that we face with scale use heterogeneity is that people differ from each other, both in what their true situation is, but also how they translate that situation to the response. And we can't disentangle those two things. And so we need an empirical tool to solve that identification problem. And that empirical tool is what we call a calibration question. So it's designed to measure that mapping I should say, we actually resurveyed about 2,500 people a few months after the first survey on the Understanding America study. And so for that subsample, we can look at how their ratings of the vignettes changed, and that's what I'm showing you on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, how their rating of their own life satisfaction changed. And those changes are also positively correlated with each other. And the reason why that
discussion. So let me just, Dan has already said it, but here's my take on what actually the core contribution of this paper is. I think it's twofold. One is that it proposes a kind of new framework for adjusting for scale use heterogeneity. And another one is that it provides some new data. I think the first contribution is the more important than the second, given that others have.
And what the table does is, and these are all links to sections in the paper, right? So what the table does is it says, here's practical advice to practitioners, to you guys from the funding institutions. You don't have time for the paper, just look at the table. And we split things along 2 dimensions of cost. So we are economists, we care about cost, right? So one sort of cost is, do we have something that is readily applicable, or do we need more research and development? Peter?
Yeah, glad to have been here today, learning a lot about the state of the art here. So I think my vague worries and ideas about subjective well-being measurement have become more precise through seeing some of the specific concerns and how they're being addressed in the Benjamin et al. Paper. I think this has also highlighted what issues we didn't discuss today, namely the kind of badness of death point and how that is probably the key crux for us in what.
So it's like we built a car, we're driving cars. Like, yeah, I don't know if you could possibly drive a car. Now it might be that the car is like imaginary, and in fact it doesn't really go anywhere. But yeah, I mean, this is some kind of this is stuff that we've been forging ahead with, and I would be absolutely delighted to kind of talk to.
The last point, Ori, I know you said that like in a lot of cases, collecting more data is not the answer, but I think one thing that I can't help thinking is there is such a strong methodological basis for doing some of this work that I feel a lot more optimistic now about just the research and funding agenda that looks more like including subjective well-being measurement in other types of interventions.
I think my vague worries and ideas about subjective well-being measurement have become more precise through seeing some of the specific concerns and how they're being addressed in the Benjamin et al. Paper. I think this has also highlighted what issues we didn't discuss today, namely the kind of badness of death point and how that is probably.
My sense is that that's something that would be sort of cruxy, and we'd like, I think presenting and sharing more evidence on that would be high value. I also mentioned, evidence relevant to the linear scale use against what you might argue to be sort of gold standards of how do people say that they would trade off, between movements between 7 and 8s and 1 and 2s among other people, et cetera. Anyways,